Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. This is an episode I've been really looking forward to. It's kind of a white whale of mine, if you will. I got introduced to our guest, Brendan Carty, through Alan Bishop. Formerly, he might have even been still Spirits of French Lick at the time, if not Old Homestead. But this is one of those episodes that I had to do a ton of research on to do an adequate job, and I hope that I've brought that here. We will try to get through all the questions, and if not, I'll throw a few over email. So I'm thrilled to welcome on Brendan Carty. He is the co-founder, the distiller, the kind of do everything of Killowen Distillery in Killowen, Northern Ireland. So Brendan, welcome on.
Thanks very much. First of all, David, you're a gentleman. I know we've been missing each other for some time, so delighted to be on with you.
The perks of being both a small distillery with a lot going on, and also both fathers of young kids. So it happened. All right, so we'll jump. Yeah, exactly. All right, so we'll jump right in. And let's say Killowen was founded in 2018, but you had a career as an architect before, and you still do to an extent to keep your certifications up to date. Short story of how you came to be interested in whiskey.
Bloody email jumped in there. Better try to turn it off. What was that short question? Was what?
Like a short story of how did you become interested in whiskey?
No, fair play, and thanks for the intro. So as an architect, I always did enjoy whiskey, and I was always very aware of the importance that it had to our culinary heritage here in Ireland and the contributions that Ireland has made to the world and to Scotland in terms of bringing modern whiskey making to the world. But at the same time, something wasn't sitting easy with me, and there was an issue. I knew that the story wasn't being told right. And to be honest, still to this day, but to a lesser extent now, because people are telling the truth about whiskey, but Irish whiskey was being abused by the multinational conglomerates and these big brutish models from overseas who owned Irish whiskey. I can't mention two names, you know what I mean. But and at the same time, there was this brilliant voices crying in the wilderness, the likes of Fionn O'Connor. For those who don't know him, he's the author of A Glass Apart, and he's the new author of this new book called Crater Project. He's also a doctor. He's got a PhD in these things as well, in Irish whiskey mash bills. He was talking about Irish whiskey the way it was made in times past and how it fell from grace, of course. And at the same time, then I was in Tasmania, in Australia, working as an architect in Sydney and taking trips down to Tasmania and visiting one particular distillery down there, Belgrove Distillery, who was making proper whiskey in the Irish whiskey tradition, a tradition that was starting to be more and more overlooked since the 1960s in Ireland. So I thought, do you know what we've got to do is fix it. We want to give up a career that I've worked very hard for. We want to make a very small distillery because I'm insane and make whiskey that matters, fix the industry and fix the category. And that's what we've been doing. And thankfully, people have been enjoying that and following the movement since. So yeah, it's a responsibility, and somebody had to do it.
And I will say, Fionn, I'm part of the Creator Project, or a supporter of it, I should say. So looking forward to reading that book. I did read his PhD thesis as part of the research for this episode, and with an idea to have him on at some point as well. So,
David, nice one. We've got a Creator release coming out at the end of this month, and it's among the best casks, I'd say, in the warehouse. You know, it's up there in the top 4 casks in the warehouse, I'd say, if not the top, and it's awesome. So yeah, the Creator Project are releasing something very special this week. Oh no, at the end of this month, sorry. So yeah, keep an eye.
I'm looking forward to it. I've had the I'm going to butcher the name, the Poitín that was released.
Yeah, and Buchel Keel Do, or down south they would say Buchel Keel Dove. Yeah, so it's Buchel Keel Do. Yeah,
which was delicious. So if I have the math right on that too, there were a couple of years between deciding, okay, I'm interested in this, and like you said, recognizing the heritage and culinary history that it brought, and saying, I want to start a distillery that's going to answer this question and try to achieve something. Were those intervening years either trying to still make it as an architect full time and trying to do that, or was it more there was a lot to work through before you could start a distillery?
Yeah, there was that seesaw, that balance whenever I was making the transition. And a lot of the times I was sort of in denial with myself. I thought, maybe I could do the distillery as a part of a part time venture. But the distillery itself we had to make a new business model because distilling of this size didn't exist in Ireland at the time. And we had to, all of the other distilleries, they build these huge plants. So we were just making something small and we were trying to market it at the same time, build it with our own hands at the same time as working full time. So we were rewriting the book and just going into uncharted territory. And it was very difficult. So that transition period was absolute hell. And there was a slight overlap before we started distilling. And I just had to pull the plug one day and say I can't be an architect anymore. And I went full time into this. And yeah, it was the most nerve wracking thing and a brutal decision to make as well because I love architecture and there's a huge amount of student debt was incurred to get that far, a huge amount of time and effort and dedication and love for another profession that's very difficult. And to be honest, I think I made the right decision. Anyway, I hope I did. There's one thing for sure. The administration involved in architecture is less fun than the administration involved in this industry. So at least here you get to get your hands dirty. You get to look at history. There is the same mix of art and science and creativity. But I have to say, this is much more fun. Plus, you get to drink more as well, which always helps. This one
Very
tastes
true.
better.
Very true. True. Just to ask one more question specifically regarding Finnan, his book A Glass Apart comes out, I think, 2016. You're founded 2 years later. At what point did you meet him? Like, did you get to meet him and chat first before founding the distillery, or was that afterwards?
Yeah, we were, when I was in Sydney, you know what Irish people are like, particularly in rural Ireland. A family death is always a big thing. So there was one time when we came home 4 times for funerals in 1 year. And every time it's a huge expense to fly from Australia to Ireland. You're flying back and, stay over and then I'd take a trip down to Dublin and I go to one of his tastings. He was doing tastings in Dublin at the time in a bar that doesn't exist anymore. And he was talking about these things. So I did have his book, and I got the book shipped out to Australia where I was reading it, and then I took it back here. It's funny because the book was actually originally printed in Australia, just the way the contract worked, and then shipped to Ireland for distribution. And then he shipped one back, and then I flew back with it, got him to sign it, and then took it back with me again. So the carbon footprint, unfortunately, in that book is absolutely huge for a distillery like us that tries to keep the carbon footprint down. But all that aside, we got to meet. I got to meet one on then, yeah, talking about these things from the outset. So, but I think the industry really needs to realize how much of a very important contribution his studies are and the giving of his knowledge to the industry is, So it's something that we're always very respectful of as well.
Sure. And you've spoken, whether in early interviews right after you started or even earlier this year with WSET. When you started, you had a crystal clear vision for what you wanted to do, and you spoke to some of that. Reviving this old style, protecting what Ireland and Irish whiskey meant. Over the past 8 years, 7 of which you've been in production, has that vision materially changed in any way?
Yes, and so the main ambition is always there, and it's steadfast. So we've got a Killowen doctrine, and what we do is it just stipulates our center of gravity, and we have a very small team here. But if somebody comes new into the team, they're required to sign that document. So we better publish it sometimes. It's good fun. It's in tatters at the moment. It comes in and out of my bag sometimes, but it's been written on the very first day that we opened, and it was signed by anybody who's ever set foot in here to work part time, and it's a lovely thing to have. And the majority of that it isn't just about backward looking and looking back in Irish whiskey, the way Irish whiskey was the king of world whiskey before the birth of this new invention of Scotch single malt, which is fantastic, of course. But pot still whiskey and why it just doesn't have the longevity now that the competitors have, but it's getting there. And real pot still whiskey and why it's so much better, why it tastes better, and the fact that we have to fix it again. So I think the category deserves that again. It fell out of fashion for a number of reasons that we might get into later, but it's about fixing it and doing it in a sustainable, proper way that reflects communities in this country and regionalism as well. And so those things, those ethos and those core principles are written there. So in order to keep the distillery going as well, we have had to diversify obviously our portfolio, which is great because we get to express ourselves with other things, bonded whiskies, gins, and a liqueur as well. So although those things weren't specifically on the business plan from the outset, the core principle of the business. The why is very much still our center of gravity. And we guard that, and all of the other ideals of the distillery are all based around that. And it's almost a militaristic approach to it. So it's steadfast and it won't change.
I've got a question later on that relates to an interview Patrick did on your team, so I'll leave that for that. So before we get into production and more about what you're trying to achieve, let's take a step back and contextualize. One of the biggest obstacles, questions, things you aim to address is the Irish whiskey GI. Let's just set some of the groundwork for what the status is right now of the Irish GI and what you feel still needs to be achieved.
Yeah, so Irish whiskey has a protection under Irish law, British law, and EU law as well. Although Britain has left the European Union, the north of Ireland is still governed by HMRC. So we've got all these different entities that are looking at what Irish whiskey is. And so Northern Irish whiskey is recognised by Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the whole country. And the thing is, the buck sits then with the Department of Agriculture in the Republic of Ireland, in Dublin, and then they send this on to Europe to get enshrined into law. And the guys in the UK, or in HMRC in the UK, in Glasgow, are like, okay, you guys take care of Scottish whiskey, and they've been very good. So that's the background to it. So realistically, this should have been resolved a long time ago by the Irish government, but unfortunately, it's been taking a very, very long time. But I suppose bureaucracy and proper bureaucracy does take time, and these things are getting resolved. I don't actually know where it is right now. I do know that it's supposed to be going out for public consultation, but it's been in this phase of supposed to be going out for public consultation now for a very, very long time. And with that, you get things like staff turnover or other priorities that might jump into the department's remit. But although this is a huge priority for people like us who care about, our culinary heritage, really care about the correction of the misinformation that's been polluted around the world about Irish whiskey for so long. These things are extremely important to us. They're extremely evocative to us, and we really get emoted by them. But the reality is, it's probably not at the top of the agenda for a government organisation who are probably under-resourced and understaffed. The people involved in it are wonderful people. They're really nice folks, but sometimes you just have to re-educate people, about what's happening. And the continuity, unfortunately, can stop. But it is in progress and it is working. One very important point to remember is that all camps, sorry, the stills can make a bit of noise in the background. One very important point to remember is that all camps are in agreement, So the Irish Whiskey Association here, dominated basically by the Pernod Ricard camp, the French company that owns Middleton, Green Spot, Yellow Spot, Redbreast, and all of that. And also then the likes of ourselves and the Irish Whiskey Guild are all in agreement that it should be corrected to reflect the historical accuracy of Irish whiskey mash bills. There's a lot of other grey areas in and around that. I don't know if you want to geek out on it or not, but that's the bones of it, and that's where we are.
I mean, we'll definitely get into. We'll get into your mash bills in particular, but I think people will most likely be familiar with some of the newer, both, and by newer I mean the old style, and the newer distilleries like yourself making this older style. They might know single pot still or pot still, or they might know single pot still and triple distilled as those buzzwords for Irish whiskey, which you've mentioned as kind of one of the three lies of Irish whiskeys. Yeah. So, it's not all unpeated. It's not all triple distilled. It's not all single pot still. So when you say pot still Irish whiskey, I know this is a big question, but when you say pot still whiskey, how do you define pot still?
For me, pot still, according to the law, is yes, it's made in a pot still. The only difference is between single pot still and single malt is that single malt is made out of one ingredient, 100% malted barley. Pot still has got oats in it, rye in it, or wheat in it, malted barley and unmalted barley. So the big camps are 30% of it can be unmalted barley type thing or unmalted barley. The whole idea is that 5% only can be oats, rye, and wheat. Okay, so 5% only. However, more in line with historical accuracy, it was 30% or over was oats, rye, and wheat. Now, I think it should be 35%, but it should be oats, rye, and wheat, and that might be a bit more historically accurate. But in order to communicate with the language of bureaucracy that's in the department, what all camps have settled for, and it makes it look understandable, is 30-30-30. So malted barley, unmalted barley, oats, rye, and wheat. So a maximum of 30% oats, rye, and wheat, and then a minimum of, of 30 of the others. And that's really how it works. My main interest is always on the oats, rye, and wheat part, because that's where the energy and the flavour is. Unmalted barley has energy and flavour as well, but the the amazing things that can be done with an increase of adjuncts of oats, rye, and wheat is phenomenal. You have to remember, this started in Ireland, this mixed mash bill culture, and then it was brought to the US, and it was survived by the wonderful US technicians and distilleries for hedgerow distilling, moonshine making, and things like that. And then in our current revival, we've actually relied on American distillers to come back. So a favourite little distillery of mine in Ireland down south, which is Blackwater Distillery, obviously John Wilcox, who is an American distiller working down there, because he was used to working with mixed mash bills. And then another one is Alex, who works in the Teeling Distillery as well. So you have to remember that he's come over from across the seas as well, from the New World of the Americas, to bring that knowledge back here too. So hats off to you guys over there for surviving it.
It's true. I forget that Alex Chasko is American, and we also got Alex at Bowen as well. So Pennsylvania thing, yeah, send him back. No, I'm kidding. It that's true. We stole Brian Nation from you, stole John Campbell from Scotland too. So got it, and a couple guys in Colorado too. Graham Wallace. So yeah, exactly. So one more piece of context, and this I love anywhere that I talk to, but I think especially in Ireland, having been there, I want to talk about your location. So Killowen's on the eastern side of Ireland, facing the Irish Sea. You're in the Mourne Gully and Strangford Geopark, similar to a U.S. national park. And I think the only comparable location I've spoken to that I can remember, at least, is Cotswolds Distillery. That's also in an area of outstanding national beauty in the Cotswold district. For you, did you always imagine that you were going to create a distillery in this area of outstanding natural beauty, and how did that location inform your build out and your operations?
Exactly. The stuff that you're talking about, this is exactly what Killowen is about. You cannot take location out of whiskey. The world is full of generic whiskey that can be made anywhere that tastes like I don't want to say too many bad things, but the thing that makes whiskey is people and place. People and place make good whiskey, brilliant whiskey, and that's something that we're extremely passionate about. So Killowen is of this place. We are of this place. This is where we're from, and the whiskey has to reflect this place. And this can go from grains, it can go from energy, and go from people, right down to microbiology. So that's something that we're very passionate about. So yeah, the Mourne Mountains is who we are and where we're from. This distillery is high up in the Mourne Mountains, overlooking the Irish Sea. It gets absolutely blasted by these, southwesterly prevailing winds that come up the east coast. And then the first bit that sits out in the east coast is County Down. After a big long strait, the whole way down the coast of Ireland, we get these tidal surges up here. There's very few trees up in this valley as well, because they're all blasted down by those storms that come the whole way over from the Gulf of Mexico. And there's this beautiful highland maritime environment. There's also a microbiology around here. We've got our own yeast types that exist in the hedgerows with their own fruits that we capture as well. So right down to the circular economy, where the feed go to the animals in the immediate fields around us, which are very small farm holdings. Average farm size here is 30 acres as well. So you got these tiny family farming community it's just a brilliant place to be a part of. And what we're trying to do is have our spirits signify who we are and where we're from. So it's all about people and place.
And I do want to say, I have, in addition to that poaching that I mentioned earlier, I also have in front of me a single barrel that came out 2 months ago or so. It sold out very quickly, so don't try to find this one, but definitely try to find the next ones that come out. This was KD 186 mixed mash bill. So this was distilled in November of 22, put in Oloroso sherry, I believe a quarter cask.
The 106 was a screamer. And there was a lot of disappointed folks that didn't get that one. It was a full-term Oloroso sherry cask. It's traditional, it says in the front of it as well, because it was a traditional style mash bill. And it was lovely. Yeah,
it was. And Yeah, it was remarkable for it's about 3 years old, a little over 3 years old, and we'll get a little bit more into the question about the mash bills and such. But number one, the color on it is amazing. I always put in a note about the color in a review because it does give you an idea of what something might taste like. And unless you're someone who only judges blind or only drinks in opaque glasses, when you see something in a glass, it's going to give you an idea of what this should taste like. And you look at this and you're like, this can't taste bad. There's no way. And it didn't. It tasted great. So we'll get into that a little bit later. One more about the location too. Because you're in the area of outstanding natural beauty and fairly remote for things, are lorries still unable to get up to the facility?
People can come to the distillery. Is that what you asked? Yeah.
I was saying, are lorries able to get up there?
Lorries can't come to the distillery, no. So we do meet the odd lorry down the lane, and it's a bit of hassle. So sometimes we have lorries come up here without ringing, and they get stuck. They've been up here for maybe half a day trying to get out, and only the weather's allowed them to get out because they can maybe back up into a field. If that had been the winter time, they won't be able to get out. But there's been a few walls knocked down and a few damaged lorries and things like that. So we've got really nice lorry partners now who know, and they've got very good, they've only the best drivers come on this route, and they know how to come up and where to meet us halfway up the mountain. And so we're very lucky. Yeah, it's great, but it's one of the challenges, and we've good relationships with the drivers now. It all comes down to the people, the drivers at the end of the day, so we're lucky.
Having an extra certification.
It is. Can I check one thing? I need to just look at these stills. These are the wash stills behind us now. So the cuts are done and the spirit still, it's off. But I'm just going to check this wash still here and flick it off. Do you mind? I'll be 2 seconds.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just we know, right, Santa? Thank you. Cheers. Bye. Sorry. Yeah, so I was just testing that's the low wines coming off the still there. And obviously we do our spirit still cuts by nose and taste, but this is the low wines. You don't want to be tasting low wines at the end of the cut. What we do is we cut them off at around 8% ethanol coming off the still, and then that's it. So
Good.
One's turned off and the other one still runs on. So yeah, we run these stills for 12-hour shifts. So we're still going.
7 to 7, right?
Yeah, 7 to 7. This one, there was an earlier start today because Patrick left early and I'm running. So Patrick got in early today at silly o'clock and he's running them. So yeah.
Gotcha. So with that, we'll jump into your setup. So you did an interview with Pot Still Radio less than a year after starting production. This was around November of 19, in which you said you were the only direct fire still in Northern Ireland, with direct fire illegal in Republic of Ireland. A couple of years later now, you're also the only distiller in Ireland using worm condensers. Are both of those still the case?
I don't actually know. I don't know if it's still the case. It's the thing about things being illegal and illegal is tough because the reason for that is there was the then president of the Irish Whiskey Association was a bit of an ignoramus, and he took a bit of a shine to bullying me at the time. So he was calling me up and telling me, you can't do this is illegal. And I was saying, well, it's not illegal because I'm an architect and it's been approved by building control in the north. And he says, well, you can't do it in the south and you shouldn't do it either. It turned out that he was just a bit of an ignoramus and he got the boot from that organisation anyway. So that might have led to that confusion at the time. But I don't know if there's anybody still doing it in the Republic. And then the worm tubs aren't being used. No, there's some people are using a combination of worm and shell and tube. But no, I think we're the only people using big chunky worm tubs as well, which leads for wonderful, wonderful whiskey, It makes for a much more slower production as well. It makes things delicious too. I can show you if you like.
Sure.
I'll take you a little bit around the distillery. Excuse the mess. I didn't think we'd be doing this today. But if we look in here, you can look at the lovely worm. So this serpentine condenser here, it just takes its bloody time, which means you're spending more time in the still. And as a result, the stills have much more flame on the base of them. So the longer you stay in the still as well, the more Maillard reactions, so proteins and sugars burn and caramelize in the base of those stills and create this lovely burnt note that just continues on and on. So that's very important. And then one of the other things that I'm just resting the camera on at the minute is our mash tun. You can see it. So the mash tun, of course, and there's the boat paddles. So mostly, I don't do this too much anymore. It's mostly Patrick, and he's a big unit of a guy. And he mixes our mixed mash bills in there as well. So sorry if I'm jumping the gun a bit.
No, it's fine. I know you've quite a few paddles have been broken over the years. I think more so with rye than with oats or with barley.
Yeah, the rye, we released a rye once, and we actually just called it the paddle breaker because it broke so many of our boat paddles. Really, really nice product too. It was, but the flavors were insane. But for some reason, rye, it just seems to drink water and sticks together like a glue. People complain about oats all the time. And oats are hard work, yes, but there's nothing as bad as rye. just
Yeah.
it's just like glue. It's good as an adjunct, but we tried to do 100% rye, and we ended up bringing it down to about 90% rye because we were adding in barley as an adjunct just to give it a bit of movement inside the mash, and it worked eventually. So these things are tough learning curves.
Yes. And that ties to another question as well. So direct fire has been a hot topic, no pun intended, a hot topic on the podcast recently. Fad Sukinder Singh of Elixir Distilling, Rich Locke at Retribution was the last episode, and Joe Sullivan with his Calandria at Minden Mill in Nevada. So in addition to those, Joe also is famous for doing not famous, he talked about doing the opposite. Like, he didn't want to change things when he started, except that he took oats out of the mash bill because oats were such a pain in the ass for him. So, he specifically said, no, I'd much rather do rye. So, I'm curious, hypothetical, like, you're probably using different types of oats. You're using Irish oats. Do you think there's something about Irish oats that makes them easier to work with or less of a pain, let's say?
Here's something that, first of all equipment's different as well. So different equipment might work differently with different things.
True.
The other thing is rye is much more of a staple crop in the US than it is here. Here it's quite a rare crop to get and work with. It doesn't grow just as well here. It grows well in mixed agriculture, but not as a standalone that well. So a lot of people, they tend not to grow it. The wetness some here sometimes mightn't agree with it. But what we've noticed is oats work really well if you use, because oats are a bit more of a staple here. So if you have a husk on an oat, it works so much better because the oat and the husk can complement each other, and then it helps break up, the gloopiness, and then it allows it to be more. It's like coffee percolation, basically. It allows it to be much more of a percolator because you got this really hard husk that acts as a percolator and keeps separation. It keeps things buoyant as well inside the mash. Because remember, in the mash, you want it to keep on mixing and mashing and being buoyant. But if you were to get oats without husks, which we did one time before, and we got them, pre-half milled, they were a disaster to work with, and we never ever worked with them again. So I know that scares the life out of a lot of brewers. So I'm wondering, maybe the rye, when you guys are using rye out there, it might be a little bit more chunky. It might have a bit more of a husk on it as well. It might be easier to work with. So yeah, it probably has a few factors.
It honestly depends a lot on who you're talking to. I mean, the producers here, I'll throw in producers in France, Germany, in Sweden, Scandinavia, Nordic countries. It's totally place by place. Whether they like it, hate it, will still use it. Never know. But so, direct fire in particular, it's, to the story you're told, it's difficult to implement. Whether to safety, zoning, getting the flame right where you want it. But for you, it sounds like it was a non-negotiable. What is the significance of that direct fire in what you're trying to achieve for Irish whiskey history?
In fairness, it does have a big link with history, but again, we can't just be backward looking the whole time. So as much as we do embrace the past, we also have to embrace contemporary culture and contemporary technology as well, as much as possible, where it's fitting. We can't just be regressive. We can't always be looking back. But I have to admit that the flavour is substantially different between flame-fed and non-flame fed. We know this from a lot of our best, like the springbank distilleries that you might consider that use fire compared to ones that didn't use fire, or even springbank distilleries that used for a small period of time, they switched to non-flame, and then they made a mistake and they spent a fortune switching back to flame again. So those are so important to consider. If you've tasted a lineup between flame-fed stills and non-flame-fed stills, the difference is chalk and cheese. One of my favourite distilleries recently in Scotland has moved away from flame. And I've tasted their new make, and I don't think it's still beautiful, I have to say, but I think it's lost a tiny bit of its charm. There's a bit more of a hurriness in there, I have to admit as well. Maybe it's not everybody's cup of tea, but that extra dimension of flavour is just as important as something being peated or non-peated. flame-fed stills have their own dimension of flavour that's distinct, and it just gives extra body and balance, you know. So yeah, keep it.
And for someone in northern Ireland, speaking geographically and with the country, traditionally probably would have been flame fed with peat flame, right?
Yeah, yeah. So Northern Ireland's a funny concept. We live right on the border, I suppose, of Northern Ireland, and we don't really recognise any cultural difference, north or south, anywhere. It's a 100-year-old line, makes no difference to me. But the cultures just along the border, that they all you would have all used peat and turf for burning. So the smell of the turf would more normally be working their way into the flavors of the malt, you know, the raw material that you make the beer out of. And but whenever you're heating a still, I'd say stills would have been used, heated with anything, with coal and with logs and with turf as well, you know, particularly in mountain regions. So a mixed use of fuel would have been used. The lovely thing about peat flame, though, under a still is that it does create a continuous heat. It's much more easy to control. It's low and it's continuous, you know, which is lovely. But that's a very good point there on the difference that the different fuel types can make. Whereas coal, it could supplement a fire, but coal would definitely burn the arse out of a still, you know. It would be too strong. So yeah, a mixture between fuels would be a good idea.
I think David Stirk spoke about coal-fired still, and that was in the context of Springbank and Campbelltown more broadly, and how coal-fired stills could make the spirit really dirty in a way, and in a very different way than peat, turf, or these things we're used to could. So I'm curious what coal might do to it. You wouldn't be able to do that nowadays, but still.
I'd love to read that. I haven't read that, to be honest, David. Thanks very much. This sounds like something really interesting I'm going to tune into. So yeah, I would agree with him, definitely.
Yeah.
You could imagine that burning in the base of the still would be much, much bigger, you know, because people think, but it's inside the still, the fire doesn't connect through. And you're like, no, you don't understand that electric stills and steam stills create this continuous ambient heat. But whenever you're hitting on the base alone with fire, you're creating these hot spots, and it creates burning points all over the still. And it's so evident when you taste the different ones. So a coal would definitely do that. I'd say it would burn the arse right out of the still. Belgrove Distillery in Tasmania is a prime example. So he uses recycled chip pan oil from the old chip shop down the road. That's our version of French fries. So the fryer for making the French fries down the road, and he recycles it into a boiler for heating a house. And he took the flamethrower out of it. He just puts it in and creates a biodiesel that just flame throws the base of the still. And he's got these big black butts and the stills from it was just completely suited. But the intensity of that hot spot under the still creates this huge milliard reaction. So his is the most extreme milliard reaction that I've ever tried. And some people find it too much, but for me, I absolutely love it. I don't smoke cigars, but there's part of cigar smoking that I love, and that's the sweet spot in there. It's the best. It's just like it's to die for, you know.
I'm the same. I don't smoke cigars, but I don't mind being around cigar smoke. Yeah, it could be a lovely evening around it.
Yeah, that first bit when you put it in your mouth, you know, the flavour you get off of the cigar itself as well with a tiny bit of smoke is great, you know.
No, I hear you. I don't know if I can get past that, but we'll see. So you one more question, and you've kind of answered this, so it can be a short question. Several years into production, you were able to add some efficiencies. So, you know, still jackets, that meant you could use less gas, or even something like, you know, you have a forklift, which your predecessors would not have had. When these either efficiencies or modern technologies come up, what is your thought process as to whether to balance, you know, honoring the history versus modern techniques and technology that you think should be added in?
Yeah, so obviously we could invest at this stage into much more efficient technologies. We've chosen not to. Getting the forklift in here was a lifesaver because we were just killing ourselves pushing around huge weights around the place. It just wasn't possible. And then trying to lift things on and off lorries was a huge health and safety hazard as well. So it was an accident waiting to happen. So that was a godsend. getting a forklift, of course. So we can be forgiven on that point too. Jackets around the stills are great. So although we run our stills for 12 hours, in the winter time, when the day is small, and you're always more like, Irish winters are horrible, damp, cold, miserable things. And, it's dark most of the day. So whenever I say 12-hour shifts in the winter time, it's 14, sometimes even 16-hour shifts. And the stills are taking forever to heat up. So this is, those jackets are great. It means you can bring the distilling day to 12 hours in the winter time, which is a godsend. It means you can get home, because otherwise you hate your job, so it's great. So yeah, that's it.
So it really comes down to like what can help us make this spirit how we want to without detracting from what we want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. That's it. Yeah, and all these little tweaks sometimes are all just brilliant little, changes. You can't stay the same forever, I suppose.
So with that, we'll jump into your production. Right. So with grains and fermentation, I think you have 3 standard mash bills. Is that right?
All right.
Yeah. Well, we did. Well observed. Yeah, we had 2, and then we slightly changed one of those. You're right. Well done. We removed a bag of wheat and replaced it with a bag of unmalted barley. So well done, David. That's the first person to have ever nailed that. So nice one.
I'll take it. So I think you have the GI compliant, the non-GI compliant, and then is the third one the poitín mash bill?
Third one, the poitín mash bill?
No, the third one is a non-GI compliant that is slightly evolved. And then, of course, our poitín mash bill changes.
Gotcha.
Changes with product, of course, as well. So, yeah, we're constantly making up different mash bills. But then there's as you say, those core ones. So I love how this subcategory. So for a lot of people out there, single pot still is like the geeky category for people who really know their whiskey. And they know what is single pot still. And then now there's these subcategories that exist in the ether that don't make sense out there. They just make sense to the real whiskey nerds out there who know what they're talking about. And then there's GI compliant and non-GI compliant. And I absolutely love how those words sort of just get knocked around out there across the Atlantic Ocean in the whiskey community. It's just lovely to hear it, because it means that poitín is important, that pot still whiskey is important. It does my heart good to hear that. Yeah, so that's the categories that sort of exist, not officially but unofficially. Yeah.
And your mash bills are, if you get for the audience members, if you get the Barrent wheels, comes with a nice insert that I'll post on the website as well. I'm holding it up in front of the camera. It's all designated by full bag or half bag so you don't get a percentage necessarily on here. I know you've got to do a percentage for HMRC because there's that whole thing, but really internally it's bag, half bag measurement. How accurate would that be for creating these authentic old style Irish pot still whiskeys?
I think it's about perspective, and it brings a bit of human emotion into things as well, and human perception, because a lot of the time when you're looking at figures, it just looks like, first of all, the figures were being broken up decimal points. Our mash tun fits 14 bags, 14 sacks, and then we break them down, full bags and then maybe half bags if need be. And they have different flavour characteristics as a result of that. And it brings it down into an emotional response. You can understand things better in that respect. If we start giving people percentages, some people do work well in percentages, but the vast majority of people can grasp human touch. So obviously I know you guys haven't accepted the metric system over there yet, probably for this reason. So there is a bit more of a human touch to the imperial system, like we don't go around measuring horses in hand, but at the same time, it's that sort of an ethos. Do you know what I'm getting at? It makes more sense to people on a human scale.
I get that. And with the mash bills that you're working with, from an early interview you did, you said that it would be, quote, arrogant and disrespectful to recreate old mash bills. So this is somewhere where you're bridging between the style, the production, and something new, honoring that. If you or Finnan or some of your contemporaries are coming across these old mash bills, to put it bluntly, like, what do you do? Do you look at this and say, okay, we could recreate it? Or do you go with like, okay, this has been working for us, let's keep doing it the Killowen way?
Yeah, see, do you have to remember, we for an experiment, for instance, we would work out an experiment if we had to and say, right, this is a recipe, let's make this as per it was exactly per this recipe. And we do that then, whether it be a poachine or a mash bill, and we'll do it. But then if we were to implement it as a clone core for a number of casks, for instance, we would do it for first of all, we would do it just for the science of the experiment and the rigor that deserves for scientific method, but it would have to then suit us in our distillery for something that we would continue on as a commercial product, and for something that would have its own identity in Cologne. You would obviously pay homage to what existed there before, but at the same time, yeah, you can't just be harking back to the past all the time. I think there's a danger in looking backwards, you know. So we always have to respect history in every form of life, be it any walk of life or any profession or any social science. But at the same time, you have to embrace the future, you know. You can't just be backward looking. So yeah, it allows for progress while always being respectful of the past. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
And you, with that, I'll jump over to peating and turfing, because it does also tie into the oats conversation. A couple years ago, your original peating shed had an accident, let's say. Have you rebuilt?
No, not just yet. So we're desperately looking forward to rebuilding. There's another couple of chores that we want to get out of the way first, and then we're going to move towards the rebuild. Yeah, so it's something fun to look forward to. But you know, in these challenging times, you have to just be careful where we invest as well. But there's a couple of really awesome projects that we're working towards as well. But and we'll share them with people as they come. But it's definitely on our priority list, and hopefully it comes this year. Let's say hopefully we'll be back peating and smoking again. So the whiskies that we've been making now for the last few years have been predominantly unpeated, which is probably music to some people's ears. But
I know a few people who would think so. So you told a friend of mine, Doug, over at Single Malt Frontier. You were talking about oats, and you said your peated oats, Dagda's oats, they hold so much more peat in the glass because of the oils. When you did before the accident, and before and when you do again once you've rebuilt, is the process for peating or turfing oats different than you would for other grains?
yeah, definitely. You see, the reason why people use barley instead of oats is because the yield for barley is much higher. At the end of the day, these big businesses, for instance, focus on that's why it influences ultimately in the legislation. And that's why the single malt is great too. It's about yield. The amount of yield you're going to get out of malted barley is huge. Malted oats produce a lot less sugar, and then as a result, a lot less ethanol, a lot less, you know, booze. So the balance sheet in the long run suffers. You know, when you're getting it in pound for pound, it takes just as much energy to grow it. But for us in Cologne, it's about flavour. And as a result, the hassle that's involved with malting oats as well. Remember that big, waxy, thick husk that I was talking about that wraps around an oat? It takes so much longer. You know when the cutoff point is when you're malting oats. First of all, you get that when you're malting barley, Marvy, you get that beautiful smell of you know, cream that's coming from it, sort of that yogurty note at the start, and then you see the shoot and the root coming out. And you know when the heat needs to come on at the right time to stop it growing. With a note, the shoot and the root aren't coming out, and they're actually coming out inside the husk for a period of time, and you can't really see it. And then it takes a lot longer to dry as well. So the issue is mold can set in very quickly with oats. So you have to dry them with much more heat, I find, and you have to try and avoid the mold from happening too, because you don't want mold. It'll create off notes. So what we then have to do is when we instead of that, you get this huge creamy custardy smell when you're malting oats. It's much bigger than it is with that yogurty fruity note that you would get with malted barley. But whenever you're cooking the oat, you have to really ramp up the heat, we find, and you have to heat it for longer as well, because you have to get right through into the kernel and get it dried out. And as a result, then you also risk burning some of them, which is lovely because then you get this lovely crystal malt note too, like a stout malt that creates these beautiful cooked flavors. And as a result, in the glass, instead of getting a creamy texture flavor that you get with oats, whenever you malt oats, you get custard instead. And I don't know too many people who don't like custardy, you know, flavors for dessert, but when you put that into your whiskies, it's to die for.
Creme brulee is my favorite dessert for a reason. So I hear you on that. With and there are a lot of questions. Again, I'm skipping over some questions for time consideration, um, and some of them are more confirmations than anything else. But one that I wanted to ask you about specifically was with the grains and the fermentation. You mentioned earlier you use this unique microenvironment that you have, the yeast, the bacteria that are coming off the mountains, that are in the hedges. You ferment in these open top IBCs, treating your wort like Belgian ales. One interview you did, you mentioned specifically that France, Taiwan, and other Asian markets are particularly interested in these wild fermentations. France, I kind of understand. I'm curious, the Asian markets I wouldn't necessarily have thought of. What have you seen that shows why Taiwan, Asian markets are interested in these wild fermentations so much?
Yeah, and we're not big in those markets per se. It's more, our international community of whiskey enthusiasts that tap into the Killowen stock organically. They continually tell us that. Fermenting foods is growing really well, and a huge part of early American cuisine was home fermentation. Well, pickled foods aren't what they are today. Today it's just vinegar on top of food, but that's not what pickling was. It was more fermenting and pickling back in the day, and sauerkrauts, things like that. And this is a huge biological advancement in science and health, and gut health is a huge part of the advancements in science now in the last couple of decades. And nowhere is that more prevalent than some of the Asian countries. So in Japan and in parts of China and in Taiwan, there's a huge interest in proper gut health, home fermenting and fermentation of foods. And whenever there actually is a flavor that comes with that as well. And there's a new development of flavors that people are enjoying in that food as well. Whenever they were over visiting our distillery and they really want to taste the wort, they want to taste the fermentation because they want to get a flavor of this as it comes through. And then hats off as well to the Belgians. Like the monks have been doing this for hundreds of years. So they've been doing this for centuries. These old monks over there making beers, and then they championed it so much that they created these fermenters. If anybody online, you can look up a cruise ship fermenter, COOLSHIP, it sounds like, but it's actually KULCHIP or something like that. And it's basically a big tray. So the fermenters are huge and they're wide and they're flat. They're like trays because they want maximal air interaction. They want maximum bacteria, maximum yeast, maximum wild fermentation. And then they pitch the yeast in afterwards to finish it off. So we do a lesser version of that, of course. But without your own, there's a homogeny out there of whiskey, and whiskey is starting to taste the same. They got these turnkey distilleries coming out of the same distillery manufacturers. It really winds me up. But if every single distillery was to encourage wild fermentation, wouldn't that be so good and so wonderful for the diversity of whiskey that we have in the world? Because every whiskey would start to more taste of its place as a result. And I think diversity is definitely the spice of life. So it's something that I'd love to see more of, and I would enjoy a lot more distilleries if they'd done that.
And to build off of that, this was also a conversation we were having with Rich at Retribution Distilling last week. When you allow the natural fermentations to take place, as you said, you could throw in yeast at the end if you want to finish it off. Could you do something like just letting the fermentation go for, let's say, 5-6 days, and then throw in a distiller's yeast, like or plus Pinnacle, whatever, to just find whatever sugars are left? Or do you prefer to just let the wild fermentation go and then have that residual sugar go over into the still?
Yeah. So there's two types of fermentation going on there. You can add your domesticated yeast afterwards, and we do add the domesticated yeast afterwards. But because there's wild bacteria getting in at the start, there's a pH crash, and you're not getting a full successful fermentation as a result of that. So there's a lot of unfermented sugars as a result. So a lot of unfermented sugars are working their way into our stills anyway, and that really adds to that burning. It is bad for your bottom line. It's bad for your yield. It's not good sense at all. But the quality of spirit comes across is much, much better. And we have done pristine fermentations with no environmental influence, and the yield is higher, but the flavour is less, And there are other distilleries, small distilleries doing that. And there's ones that have basically learned from Killowen and they haven't basically acknowledged us. We love to acknowledge other distilleries whenever we learn from them and tell them the wonderful things, but There's people doing it now, which is great to see, but sometimes you just take their hat off and say, yo, fair play. We learned that from the Killowen gigs. It would be nice.
Yeah.
at least everyone's doing the right thing.
No, I like to say, like, you were inspired by X, like you mentioned Peter at Belgrove. That's important. There's a lineage of thought that goes into this. Yeah.
And then always, I'm actually always inspired by the guys in the States and how they're looking back and contemporary and traditional at the same time. The likes of Alan Bishop there as well, I love the bravery and I love the connection to people in place and to tradition. So it's great to see that continuation of thought going around the world.
I'm gonna put aside a peating question that I had for now in favor of production. So back almost 2.5 years ago, I would say, you were on 4-leaf whiskey, and you said at that point you were struggling to be able to put enough stock down to age it even longer while still meeting the current demands that you were seeing. I think this was before you put the new still in, so it could have changed, but just in case, how is that balance today?
The problem's even more profound. The new still that we put in had the capability of creating more whiskey, but what we've done instead is we just created the same amount. But what it has meant is that we can run them distilled simultaneously. So we can, rather than working 5 days a week, we can distill 3 days a week and produce, because we're using that extra still type thing. And it meant that life is now more sustainable. I can now spend time with some time with a wife and children, whereas before things were impossible. It was constant work, burning yourself out constantly. I've yet to take a proper holiday in 8 years, but I think we went away once for 4 days to the Basque Country. But yeah, there's a lot of travel with work, mind you, but no, I just don't get time off. So this has allowed some sort of a work-life balance,
Fair. And you're, in the same interview, you were saying you don't always fill casks to the fullest. I know you don't fill the stills to the fullest too, because you want that extra room for reflux and condensation. Have you, with the stills at least, have you found that good balance of like filling just looking at the insert here, the wash still 50%, the spirit still 20%? Like, could you go higher with that and still have that balance, or is that where you want to stay?
No, we keep it low. We fill the two of them at 50%. The wash stills are 50%, and sometimes they're a little bit less, because if we have an accident with the fermentation run, or with the mashing, and we're doing a different mash, and then we've got a little bit less wash coming out, then so it drops the yield down. And then the spirit still, if we've got a lesser yield, maybe there's something wrong with the fermentation that didn't work well, then that could change our spirit run as well. We've even got less in the spirit still. So these things change, and they change with environmental factors. They change with maybe trying out a new mash bill, or something goes wrong in the day. Maybe the kettles weren't working right, or maybe a roller mill broke down halfway through a mash. We're like, well, we got to finish it now. So these things can change and they can vary, which is lovely, because the variation is important. No two clones will ever taste the same, but the quality will always be there. So this is the cool thing about it.
Inconsistency in flavor, but consistency in quality. So I think how you put it once.
For sure. No, you're right. I got to check this still again. Just give me 1 second. All right.
Go for it.
Yeah, it's going to be a while.
All good.
So when you're, if I'm extrapolating that same kind of line of thought, when you're not filling a cask all the way, it's really based on what the yield is off the still versus I don't want to fill the cask all the way.
Yeah, well, I suppose sometimes we don't fill the cask all the way, and that's fine, but most of the times we actually do. But there has been occasions whenever you'll decide, not to fill a cask the full way, because you might want a little bit more cask influence happening, But mostly not filling the still is the most important part, because the rest allows for reflux. And whenever you're heating up the wash, I suppose that interaction with copper is so important, because when you're spending an extremely long amount of time in your still, most distilleries are spending, 4 to 5 hours running their stills. Our stills are run for 12 hours. So that interaction with copper means that the residual sulfites that exist in the still, they don't come off in your spirit. So a lot of spirits taste extremely young because they're rushed through the stills, and they're quite aggressive, and there's the sulfites everyone knows sulfites taste like. In the worst case scenario, the sulfur is the note that you're getting, and like it's a bad smell, and that does come out, and a bit like baby vomit at times as well. But if you're spending a huge amount of time in your still, that interaction with the copper, that constant reflux, where it's condensing and dripping off the copper and then coming out in the end, it makes for a much more impressive spirit. And the spirit's ready to drink then right away. Again, that's not good for your balance sheet. You could run your stills fast and just build up your stocks, and then wait, and then you got this cool spirit at the end. But at Killowen, we've spirit that's ready to drink straight off the still, and it's much more enjoyable that way.
I think that's a good point to move over to your poitín. I want to spend at least a couple minutes talking about this because it's a major point for Irish whiskey and Irish culinary history, heritage. So you said your poitín mash bill is going to change. I've seen a couple of different versions, even in the last couple of weeks, coming out. But in general, it's a mix of Killowen, Great Northern, oats, rye, and wheat. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's it. Indeed it is, yeah. Malted barley, unmalted barley, oats, rye and wheat. Sometimes you go for a big, heavy oaten one. You might go for 95% oats, 5% oats. At one stage, poitín in Ireland was getting, because Ishkavaha whiskey, poitín and Balkan were sort of these words that were being thrown around and were evolving in different regions in Ireland at the time. One time, the favourite poitín at the time was Balkan. And Balkan was in the 1600s. Again, this is totally down to the research from Fionnán O'Connor. And it's half malted barley, half malted oats, 100% peat smoked, that type of thing. And it's absolutely lovely. So those things are great, I have to say. And that spirit that was created was phenomenal. And we ended up leaving, because it was so successful as a poitín, we ended up leaving some of it down to see what we would do as a whiskey. And it was so lovely. And it was the most highly peated spirit that we'd ever produced, but because of the oats, the flavors just express themselves completely differently in the glass. You get a little bit of blueberry and a lot of other notes in there as well. And I let Fionnán O'Connor in the Creator Project tell you about Balkan and the whole flavor around it, but it's the whole story around it, the history and the satire that existed, because you have to remember Ireland was writing satire in the 1600s before the subjugation of the culture and the genocide here and everything else that came afterwards. And we had a very proud literary tradition that just disappeared overnight, And this poitín was part of our culinary heritage and was enjoyed by the ruling classes, the chieftains and the lords of the Gaelic lords at the time. And it's just, the stuff's to die for. It's awesome. It was particularly favoured at wakes and funerals as well. And there's a lovely book called Stair Éamon Ó Clérach, and that's what Fionnán's whiskey version of this when you turn it into whiskey, this poitín, what it tasted like. And Stair Éamon Ó Clérach, I just explain it as fear and loathing in County Leitrim in Ireland. So these basically ogreish, monstrous creatures start chasing this boy, and I'll let him get into it. But if you want to hear more about that, you need to get involved in the Creator Project. Yeah, and that's getting released at the end of this month. I think it was a 120-litre cask, and we tapped into it a few times, so there's not a huge amount of bottles, but it's about 130 bottles or something. Yeah, it's well worth it.
Yeah. I'm still catching up because I joined the project late. It was something in like the high 600s of order number, so it was still within the original group, but a little bit late. So I've got videos to catch up on and talks that have been given, but for the purposes of Killowen and the poitín that you're creating too. So poitín was illegal from 1661 to 1997, but it survived all that time. It was still being produced. Your distillery is on an old poitín smuggling route, and to me it calls to mind when we spoke with Fair Isles Distillery in the Faroese Islands. They were under Danish rule for 3 centuries, and the Faroese language was made illegal, yet it survived in those 3 centuries, relatively untouched at that, until it was made legal again. I know this is a large question, and we can certainly, you feel free to say, like, ask Finan about this instead. But in the time that it was illegal, to 1997, how did poitín change versus stay the same?
Yeah, well, if you see, the idea of it's becoming illegal, so to speak, is a difficult one because it was basically the formation of excise duty, and the indigenous people weren't allowed to own businesses producing it. So it was much more heavily clamped down on. Whereas in the Scottish, who are a little bit less Irish than us, were a bit more acceptable, I suppose, and were allowed to own businesses. But in Ireland, the subjugation of culture and racism was so much more profound that you couldn't have owned a business here and created your own poaching and your own whiskey. So it was just completely pushed underground, completely, and it had to survive only as. But it was part of culture. It was science. It was medicine. It was barter. It was currency. It was everything, and it was pushed underground. But it still existed. There was also a period then known as the Poachine Wars, whenever the redcoats used to chase people down and demand, the taxation and because it was the only thing going in these small communities, people used to get up in arms and defend the communities right to death. And they would have used stones against, huge guns and things like that. And I'll not get into the different cases, but there's one, for instance, where Blackwater Distillery is down in the bottom of Ireland, and then there's plenty of examples in Inishowen up in the north, in Donegal, which was up in the very most northern point, where there was the highest number of cases of poaching. And this is turf country, peat country as well. And then so it has evolved. And it evolved from before the colonisation of the Africas, which brought about the slave trade, and then the New World, and then flooding of Ireland with molasses. So then, for a while, an adjunct to the mash bill became molasses, treacle. So it was a rum style mix that came into a lot of them as well. And then in more recent times, then any carbohydrate that could have been used was used. There's lovely stories as well about the poaching makers in prison making it out of cornflakes and Rice Krispies in more recent times too. So it has a lot of different stories to it as well, and it can include adjuncts of fruits and vegetables. But all in all, what it really should just include is, in my opinion, is malted grains, and then the other adjuncts can come in and go. And so there's a huge conversation about what exactly is poaching nowadays, but it's very special. And there was huge amount of poaching makers out there as well. So you wouldn't have just gone for any poaching maker. You had choice, and you went to a good one. One very important point to note is that in the 1800s, Bushmills made a whiskey called Inishowen style whiskey, and it was a big hit. And this was a peated whiskey that they made in an attempt to wane the local population of Inishowen whiskey. Now, the point to make here, there was no such thing as Inishowen whiskey, but Inishowen was the biggest part of Ireland that made poaching. They had more poaching stills per square kilometre than anywhere else in Ireland. They had more arrests per population. The poaching wars were the most prevalent there also. It was a huge export to the Scottish Islands, the Irish Islands, right the way across down through Ireland. They made copious amounts of poaching up here. So there was no legal distilleries. There was no Inishowen style whiskey. There was no Inishowen whiskey. So what they meant when they created this Inishowen style whiskey was poaching style whiskey. And those labels can be viewed out there. And I think that's a lovely win for the category. And it's a lovely part of history as well. So one that's not just well known as well. So I suppose I could talk about poaching all day. One more wee thing as well. I suppose there's a lovely song out there called The Humours of Whiskey. And that's that interconnection of poaching and whiskey. And when did whiskey become whiskey, and when did poaching become poaching? Because they were both intertwined. They were both the same thing. Whiskey is Ishkavaha, and then poaching means it was done in the little pot. So they were both just different nicknames for the same thing. And The Humours of Whiskey is a very old song as well, and it's worth listening to. Hosier done a little verse of it as well, but you're better off listening to the full version. And they just changed that word around. Some people call it the crater, which is what Fionnán O'Connor, Creatur. There's a fada, an accent over the U, what we call a fada. So crater, some people call it craters, would stick to the creature, the best thing in nature. So, and he's calling it poaching, he's calling it whiskey, he's calling it crater, he's calling it a number of different things the whole way through the song. It's totally interchangeable. It's all the same thing. So whenever I say poaching is whiskey's mummy, I mean it. It's part of the same family. It's part of the same DNA. It's part of the same word. It's a huge part of our cultural heritage, and we can't let it go just because it's not fitting for some whiskey snobs out there. When whiskey is done right, when poaching is done right, it's absolutely brilliant, and it's so important that we bring it back. And unfortunately, there's one or two poaching brands that aren't making it really well, that might be ruining it for everybody. That seems to happen every 15 years or so. But let's just follow that space.
And with you, so I think the I won't spend too much time because I know we got about 15 left, and I want to make sure to cover a couple more questions. But one more about poaching in particular was, you said you have a couple that you let age, or I think rest might be a better word, because I know that terminology can get troublesome. Right. So you have the I don't want to pronounce it wrong, but the CUIGE collection of well-rested poachines. So what is that for Killowen fans?
The well-rested poaching, so you can age poaching for up to 10 weeks. And we created one called Cuaga at the very start, which was finishing it for 10 weeks in these different beer casks from all around Ireland. And they were done these little small bottles, and it was about premiumising the category of poaching and showing poaching what it can be. And then we've done specials since then. We've done one last week called Eru, which focused, that was the original god in Ireland that all of the other deities came out of. It's like that idea of, in Greek culture, the first it was cosmos, and then it descended afterwards. So Erie is wonderful, and then it's lovely because then our word for spring, Erich, comes out of that. And then from there came Boan, which one of the distilleries is named after in Ireland as well, and the life-giving river and whatnot. So they all tend to focus on something, about re-educating people about our past and something that we could be a bit more proud of. One of them focuses as well then on the Dagda. The Dagda was an awesome creature. It was one of the Irish gods as well. He was our god of war. He was also our god of fertility. So he went around with a club that he used to fight people with. He's like our version of Thor, if you like, or Odin, and so he's going around, not might get my gods mixed up in the Norse mythology, sorry. But then he used to go around fighting, but this was also his fertility piece as well. So the reality was his hammer wasn't actually a hammer, it was his big member that he keeps between his legs. So he used to fertilize the landscape with it as well. So because he was the goddess of fertility, people used to pray to him for the god of fertility for, reproduction, not just for human beings, but also for crops and farms and things like that as well. So things get very raunchy and very dirty, as you can see in Irish culture and in Irish deities. And so we try to educate people about those things too. And I know, especially since Victorian times, and we've become very reserved and we're not allowed to, to talk about these sorts of things. And even as a result, during the more recent Enlightenment in Ireland at the turn of the last century, whenever we were rediscovering these stories, a lot of them were kind of whitewashed as well because it wasn't nice to talk about these things, the likes of the Lady Gregory's or whatever. But in reality, things are pretty crazy and pretty raunchy, and it suits very well with flavours of poaching, which people aren't really meant to be drinking poaching, but they do. And it can be it allows you then to be expressive with huge, big, bold, long flavours, things that deliver in the nose, the palate, and the finish. And I think that's what Irish culture really can be, and it can really be at its best when it's championed. It's wild, but it's very well balanced, and I think we've got a responsibility to do that. And Killowen drinkers, I think they appreciate that, and they appreciate the wildness. And things can be quite jokey sometimes. We can be can be funny, but at the same time, there's always a seriousness to it. And at the end of the day, it can't leave this distillery unless it tastes good. If it's going to have a Killowen label on it, it has to be bloody worth it, And so we've great support for it. We would be nowhere without our support base. Would be nowhere without them. So we have to deliver quality to them every time we do a release. So that's the pressure that I feel every day, And
I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't do a shout out to the Killowen cult. So the official Killowen cult, it is independent. It's not run by Killowen. To what you said, it's a hell of a cheering section. So I'm curious, how early in Killowen's history did the cult pop up?
You don't know when it really popped up. There was always this lovely following of people, coming out of across the country, Dublin and Belfast, and more importantly in the States. There's one guy in particular, MP Moho, he calls himself online, Mike Mohan. He's a great guy, and he's got a Killowen cult tattoo here in his neck. So he goes to work with the collar up looks resentful. So he's an absolute legend, and Mike's family are very welcome here. We love to see them come visit, and he was very welcoming to us when we went to Minneapolis as well. And the likes of those guys in the Delaware, Matt Morrison, and these were the sort of the people crystallising it at the start. And then there was conversations happening, and then it went, the Belfast Whiskey Club and Paul Kane and Ian Gard and all these guys down in Dublin, and all these brilliant folks. I can't start naming names because I just won't be able to name them all. And then springing up in Germany, parts of Scotland as well, Italy, and yeah, across the States and across Ireland. Cork. We've a huge amount of legends that live in Cork and Kilkenny and Ireland as well. And yeah, Then there's Australia and South Africa as well. There's a good few legends down in South Africa as well, and it just keeps going and going. Alberta, it started off very strong, Alberta in Canada, and branched its way over then, of course, into Toronto. So it's just this lovely community of people. I'd love to do a map and just show, where they all are, and they all communicate, with each other. It's just a lovely community, and they police themselves. There's one or two Egypts have been in that organisation before who've been removed for extreme bad manners or for things that shouldn't be socially unacceptable. So it's nice to see that communities can police themselves as well, which is a nice social experiment too. That it's ever evolving, and I can't say a bad word about them. So
No, it's lovely. Not every distillery has that. I mean, we all have our distilleries we support, and they all have their kind of fan clubs, but I've only been a member for a short time. I joined maybe a couple of weeks ago because I didn't want it to color the interview too much, but I wanted to see what the fan reaction was like. And to have people into you so strongly that any release that comes out is devoured, it seems. I think it's a good word for it. It must do wonders for your self-esteem as a distillery.
It's an honour. And you have to remember that the distillery itself has a personality of its own. So I'm probably one of the main owners, and then there's other owners of it too. There's its staff members, and then there's this community. And the distillery has a personality that I'm only happy to help to work along. But like, nobody knows what Killowen's going to be in a few weeks or a few years. It's constantly evolving. It's in its adolescent stage now, I feel like, and I'm only a custodian of it in its current moment in time. So I'm as much a part of the cult as the rest of them are. So, it sounds stupid, but yeah, the distillery has a personality of its own, and it's moving in its own direction, and we're just guiding it and working with it. It sounds a bit mad, but yeah, that's the way I see it anyway.
No, it's great. So in our last few minutes, I got two questions I want to ask you here. And the first one is coming back to the question of this heart of Irish whiskey. I was listening to you on Off Topic Whiskey earlier this year with Whiskey Shaman, and the conversation led me to kind of a simple question. So you said there are older, larger distilleries that are now maybe they're making a poitín, or they're making kind of an older style, more authentic Irish whiskey. Many, if not most of them, have not announced it or made it public that they're doing this, but it's being made. I'm curious to ask this of you, without naming any names, of course. Even if the mash bill is right, even if the production is as close as possible, do you think a big distillery or a heritage distillery can achieve what you're trying to achieve in creating a true Irish style whiskey?
Yeah, true Irish style whiskey. That's a very interesting choice of words. So yeah, it's that's us trying to frame what it is that we're trying to make here. So well done. But I first of all, I commend any of them that are trying to do it. What they're trying to do is going to end up being much, much better than they've currently produced to date. That is a fact. If you're a big distillery, though, can you create what's done in a small, hands-on distillery that's just obsessed with people in place and the really slow, awfully slow, difficult production methods that we have, mixing by hand, running our stills this long? I don't think it'll reach the same standard, but it's definitely going to be a really good standard. And I think as a result, Irish whiskey is going in the right direction. Hopefully that makes sense.
Absolutely. I was thinking about, just to give an example of it, how Jim Beam entering the American single malt scene with Claremont Steep. There were people who said, like, this isn't as unique or as authentic, whatever word you want to use in there, because it's from a giant distillery known for making bourbon. But at the same time, like, one, it was a good product, I thought. And even more importantly, it got into the mainstream. So even if maybe people hadn't heard of American single malt before, but they heard about Claremont Steep. So maybe that opens the door to the smaller distilleries, the more authentic ones, however you define that. And I can kind of see that happening in your direction as well.
I really hope so, David. That would be wonderful, And yeah, Do you know what? You're right. And it really should if you think about it. Because some of these huge distilleries have actually survived the term single pot still. Pot still. It's been survived by the amalgamation, of course, and closing down all of the other houses and changed it slightly, the category, but they still survived the term, which paved the way then, I suppose, for real pot still producers then afterwards to produce their whiskey. So yeah, with that same mindset, hopefully that works, you know. But just when we're talking about single malts over in the States, I have to say my favourite one is Minden Mill. Obviously, I've got a soft spot for the guys there, so anybody who wants to lean into a distillery in the States, that's the one to follow, you know. They've got great guys working there too, so love them.
Yep.
We had Joe on recently, and I love the single malt, and it helps. I think you guys are. Oh, I might be confused. I might be thinking of Woven here, but are you guys both under Foldy family for distribution now?
Under Foldy family for distribution now?
Yeah. We're Killowen in a very small way. You know, it's probably barely worth talking about, but yeah.
But it mattered. And then the last question I'll throw to you. Normally I like to end on a legacy question, but I think it's pretty clear what your legacy wants to be or what you want your legacy to be. So instead, I want to look backward for the last question, which is when you were younger, when you were becoming friends with guys like your co-founders, Liam, Shane, when you were maybe interested in whiskey as a consumer, but not as you are now. Thinking back to the interview you did with Doug at Single Malt Frontier, you pressed that Ireland needs to be prouder of its mythology and its language and its culture, with whiskey part of that. And you've spoken to that during this interview. When you were younger, did you ever imagine yourself as someone who would be pushing kind of that Northern Irish pride in this way?
That's some question, all right. Do you mean the whole idea of, first of all, yeah, it's I never thought, I've always known that I've loved the culture of this whole island and all of the people that live on it and what they represent. And I never thought I'd get the opportunity to try and be an ambassador for a culinary heritage. So there's Ireland is incredibly regional. If you go 5 miles in this direction or 5 miles in that direction, you get a different accent change. And people are very proud of who they are and where they come from. And I think it's just really good fun. It's the most regional place that I'm aware of. Accents are just one aspect of it. And if we could bring our culinary heritage into that again, it would be really good as well, because we don't share a huge difference in our culinary heritage between our nearest neighbours for probably a number of reasons. But this is one thing that we do really well in Ireland. We make really good spirits, and we always have done. And if we could focus on the spirits that were made in these different areas and really celebrate them as much as possible, it would be great. And then it ties in with the cultural differences that exist in every nook and cranny. And that's not defined by a 100-year-old line in the sand. Irish culture, I think, is much, much bigger than that, you know?
Well, Brendan, as there were so many questions that I had to cut down just for time, but if anything else is pressing, I will follow up with you. But can you hang on with me for just a minute after we finish recording? Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Brendan, for coming on to talk about Killowen Distillery in Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland, if you don't want to break it between the two official designations, as it is close to the border. This really conversation I was looking forward to for a long time, and it did not disappoint. So thank you for coming on. Thank you everyone for listening. Please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you are listening. Let's keep those 5-star ratings going on Apple, Spotify, and I think Amazon as well. And check out the show notes for more information, and I'll see you all next week.